Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, today we want to talk about a famous Japanese folktale and how it might have inspired Oda in the creation of the ancient weapons. And I think by looking at this folktale and looking at the various instances in which it very clearly parallels events in One Piece, and Oda has clearly taken inspiration from it, look at other elements of that story and think how it could potentially impact the future developments that we do not yet know about the ancient weapons. And potentially even beyond the ancient weapons itself, this could also have implications for the Void Century as a whole. But yeah guys, I really expect that you will enjoy this video, but before we get into it, I want to give a huge thanks to Dave of Or Jackson, who several months ago after I made a video talking about the Void Century, sent me this information to see if I can make anything from it. While Dave didn't really put an emphasis on the folktale itself and his original theory about it, I do want to include his theory in the description for you guys to check out because I think it's really interesting, and I think that there are many ways in which you could possibly draw conclusions from this folktale and One Piece. And so I think that the best way to go about this is just to tell you this story of the lost fishing hook. Once upon a time, long ago, there lived two brothers. In order to avoid confusion with their names, we will call them the fisherman and the hunter. These brothers were as different from each other as night from day. The hunter was generous and good, and spent his days in the cold mountains hunting for pheasants to feed the family. While the fisherman was greedy and cruel, he spent his days by the sea, fishing for food to feed only himself. One day the hunter walked out into the mountains, and looking to the sea, he decided he would try his hand at fishing. He borrowed his brother's hook and sat at the edge of the sea. There he fished for many hours, but had no luck. At last the sun began to set, and the hunter stood to leave. But suddenly, the hunter felt something grab his line. He pulled and pulled, struggled to hold on to the line, but alas, the line snapped, and the fish swam away with the hook in his mouth. When the hunter returned home, he told his brother what had happened. The fisherman was furious. "You must find my fishing hook," he cried at his brother, "and you may not come back home until you have. That was a special hook." Sad and discouraged, the hunter walked to the edge of the sea and sat down to think. "How will I ever find a lost fish hook?" he asked himself. And while he thought to himself, there suddenly appeared an old man by the sea. "What's wrong, hunter?" asked the kind old man. And the hunter recounted the tale of the lost fish hook. "Do not worry," said the old man, "I will help you." Plaiting together withes of bamboo, the old man fashioned a basket, and then from within the basket the hunter set sail far out to the sea, hoping that one day he might come across his brother's lost fish hook. But once reaching the endless bounds of the sea, the basket finally burst its fragile seams and began to sink. Down it fell, through the endless depth of seaweed forests, till it descended into the courtyard of the great castle, the house of Waratsumi. Waratsumi was the god of the sea, or in other various translations referred to as Ryujin, the dragon god. And Ryujin, or Waratsumi's castle, was known as the Castle Ryugu. The hunter, realizing that he could breathe, calmed down, and saw before him the exquisite palace built of shimmering pearls and glistening shells. Sitting outside the palace, he saw to his delight a beautiful maiden. When she looked up and saw the hunter floating towards her, she blushed and turned to go inside the palace, for she was a modest maiden, and she wanted to announce the arrival of the stranger to her father, the king of the sea. She has several names, but one of the names in which she goes by is Otohime, the daughter of the god of the sea and the princess of the ocean. The hunter landed on the soft sand, and a moment later the maiden and the good king of the sea greeted him. "Welcome to our watery world," said the king. The hunter was so enchanted with the beauty of the palace and the kindness of the sea creatures that he soon forgot all about his brother's fishing hook. The members of the court were gracious and welcoming. The hunter spent many days wandering through the reedy gardens, staring in wonder at the many creatures he had never so much as imagined. Soon he fell in love with the princess of the sea. She too fell in love, for she sensed that the hunter was a good and kind man, and it was not long afterwards that the hunter and the princess married. You could say that the hunter found a new home under the depths, and so many months passed in happiness. But then one day the hunter woke with a start, for he had remembered his brother's fishing hook. "My dearest wife," he said, "I have forgotten a promise I made. I must find my brother's fishing hook and return it to him, for I told him that I would. A man must always keep his promises." The princess agreed. "You will need help," she said, and she went to her father to seek his advice. Soon the king of the sea had gathered all the sea creatures together. "We seek a fishhook, lost many months ago." The sea creatures looked at one another. "Have you seen a fishhook?" They bubbled and gurgled and murmured as the king walked through the crowds. At last he came upon a sad-looking shark, who sat without moving. "What's this?" asked the king, and he looked into the sad shark's eyes. Slowly the shark opened his mouth, and the king saw a terrible sore. He reached inside and gently pulled. "Here is your hook," the king said to the hunter. At last, finding the hook that the hunter had set out to the sea to retrieve many months previously, he smiled. But then with a sad heart he turned to the princess. "I must return to my old home to give my brother back his hook," he said. "I do not know if I will ever be able to return, but maybe you would be able to live with me there." The princess embraced her husband. "I will come in a year and a day. But if I am to come and live with you on land, you must make a palace for me as wonderful as ours below the sea. My husband, I am going to give birth to your son, and I wish him to live a life as gentle and as sweet as our life here. Remember, 1 year and 1 day." The hunter promised that he would, and with that he bade his wife farewell. The king of the sea turned to his son-in-law and said, "I wish you success, and I want to help you. Here is my magical jewels, also known as the tide jewels, or the kanju and the manju. If you need help, you must ask them to bring the sea to land, and the jewels will obey you. And if you tell them to send the sea back to its bed, that too shall happen. For these jewels each control the tides." And with that the hunter climbed onto the back of a dolphin and rode up and up and up. And at last he came to the shore where he had lost his hook so many months before. There he saw his brother, the fisherman, sitting on the beach, staring out at the horizon. "Here is your hook," the hunter cried to his brother. But the fisherman was furious, for he had hoped that the hunter would never return. The fisherman rushed at his brother, drawing out a huge silver dagger. The hunter was astonished at this, but not as surprised as he ought to be, for his brother had always been this way. But remembering the tide jewels, he looked down and whispered, "Bring up the sea." At once, an enormous wave rolled up onto the beach and swept the fisherman into his arms. The hunter thought to himself, "I wish to create a home for my wife, my princess, and my soon-to-be-born son. A peaceful and sweet place, as I had promised that I would create, so that my wife and I and our children may live up on the surface. But with my brother here, the fisherman, residing in this place, it may not be possible." And so with a deep sigh, the hunter held the tide jewel up to his mouth and whispered, "Return to your bed." And with that, the wave rolled backwards. The hunter, letting go of the fisherman, let the ocean sweep his brother away forever. The hunter then set to work at building the palace that his wife had envisioned. He worked night and day. And finally, after 1 year and 1 day had passed, his wife arrived. But the palace was not yet completed. The princess of the sea, Otohime, told her husband, "I cannot stay with you, good husband. I will bear our child here, but then I must return to the sea." And that is what happened. That is the very strange ending to the story of the lost fish hook. From then on, every evening the hunter stood at the edge of the sea, dreaming of his wife. And below the sea, every evening, she stared up at the shimmering lights above, dreaming of her husband and child. And so maybe some of you out there aren't going to appreciate me telling this story in pretty much its entirety, but I really felt like it was necessary in order to get the complete picture as to why it's blatantly obvious that this story has inspired Oda. The hunter is Joy Boy. Both the hunter and Joy Boy have strong connections to the kingdom below the sea. Both, while there, met the princess of the sea. In the case of the hunter, it was the princess Otohime, and in the case of Joy Boy, it was the princess who has not yet been named, but we know as Poseidon. Both the hunter and Joy Boy presumably come from the surface, and both made a promise with the princess of the sea to one day be able to live with them on the surface, and they both failed. Both the hunter and Joy Boy had enemies on the surface. The hunter had his brother, and Joy Boy had the world government, or at the time, the 20 kings. Both the hunter and Joy Boy received great powers from the ocean. The hunter received the tide jewels from the king of the sea, the dragon god Watatsumi, while Joy Boy received the powers of the ancient weapon, Poseidon. The tide jewels possess the power to call forth and bring back the ocean's waves, a power which is capable of both destroying and saving others. Whereas Poseidon is stated to have the power to save thousands of lives when guided by love, but with evil intentions, it can sink everything into the ocean. To even take the connection between Poseidon and the tide jewels further, the tide jewels were probably inspired by, the folktale itself were inspired by, wishing stones, which is very similar to the Philosopher's Stone. Magical stones which could grant your any wish. And in some versions of the Lost Fishhook, keeping in mind that there are many, you didn't even need to speak to the stones for them to grant your desires. You need only have them and wish for the tides to act. And I think that this is very reminiscent of the powers of Poseidon to control the Sea Kings. The Sea Kings arrived when Poseidon subconsciously wished for help. And finally, both Joy Boy and the hunter had magical vessels in which they were able to sail the sea with. The hunter had the basket fashioned by the old man by the sea, whereas Joy Boy presumably sailed upon the Pluton. And this is without getting into the small details which it's pretty apparent that Oda may have been inspired by, such as the shark who had the fishhook in mouth, may be able to be described as an influence for Megalo. And when talking about Watatsumi or Ryujin or the King of the Sea, his castle, Ryugu Castle, the very same castle that is in One Piece. And even looking at Ryugu Castle, you even have a dragon ornamented around it, which I think is a pretty clear nod to Watatsumi, the dragon god of the sea. And so guys, I want to say this again, there are many ways in which you can take this story and then potentially derive conclusions to theories of One Piece. Even Dave, who sent me the connection to this story and made a theory specifically around this, sent this to me with the idea that I might connect it to my theory about the Grand Line and how the tides are important combined with the tide jewels. Will the myth of the tide jewels make an appearance in this story of One Piece? I think it's a great question. I think that it's definitely something Oda could do. Or if you take the connection with Joy Boy and a conflict with his brother, there's already a lot of people saying that Blackbeard's family ancestry was that of treachery. That his ancestors, who were also part of the D clan, betrayed the ancient kingdom. Is Blackbeard's family perhaps related to the fishermen? And I think that there's already striking parallels between my previous theories with Joy Boy being in this case the hunter, or in One Piece the leader of the ancient kingdom, and his necessity to create a peaceful place on the surface for the princess of the sea to live, or in One Piece find a home on the surface for the fishmen. And so in this case, the palace is a metaphor for a peaceful place for the fishmen to live. But the palace could not be completed. This ideal place to live could not be created, both in the case of the story of the Lost Fishhook, and potentially in this story of One Piece with Joy Boy and the Ancient Kingdom. But the moment that I decided to tell the story in its entirety, I decided to cut out a lot of the discussion. I'm gonna leave that up to you guys. If your imagination went wild, then feel free to make theories on it or discuss it in the comment section. I really want to focus this discussion on the ancient weapons. I think that we could potentially find inspiration for all three ancient weapons within the story of the Lost Fishhook. We've already talked about the connection between the basket and Pluton. Now keep in mind that the basket was not a weapon that could single-handedly destroy islands. They aren't the same thing. And I don't think that we should expect Oda to take a popular folktale within Japan and then just copy it verbatim. Oda will be inspired by things and then add his twists onto them. What's important is that both the Pluton and the basket were magical vessels in which the hero used to sail to the ends of the sea. And we've also talked about the connection between Poseidon and the tide jewels. But it's very important to understand the tide jewels because there were two of them, the Kanju and the Manju. The Manju which could bring forth a wave, and the Kanju which could call it back. Poseidon's power was described as a power which could sink the world underneath the waves, so Poseidon's powers could essentially be the Manju. Again, here, they aren't exactly the same, right? Poseidon is a mermaid princess who can control the sea kings and not actually control waves. It's more of like a metaphorical analogy of what her powers do. Poseidon commands the power of the ocean much the same as the Manju. And that may leave us with our final connection. The other tide jewel, the Kanju, being an inspiration for the powers of the ancient weapon Uranus. If the basket is the magical vessel which can sail to the ends of the sea, and the Manju is the power of the sea, then maybe the Kanju can be described as the power to counter the sea. Then maybe we can look at this and say that the ancient weapon Uranus would have a similar ability, if not exactly the same. The Kanju can recede the waves. I really doubt Uranus can do that. But as I said earlier, there are many versions of the story of the lost fishhook. And one of the versions and the powers given to the tide jewels really sticks out to me. In one version of the story, the tide jewels are not actually the tide jewels and they cannot actually control the tides. At least not directly. Rather, guys, they control the wind. I know that this is not a crazy speculation. Many people have been here before, including myself. But I don't think that anyone has approached it from this direction before. I've always thought that it would be perfect for the ancient weapons in the story of One Piece to complement each other perfectly. Pluton being able to sail on the sea and master any bit of the ocean. Poseidon controlling the power of the ocean itself. One Piece is a pirate manga, and the ocean is a huge facet of the story. Both the Pluton and Poseidon relate to various abilities of control over the ocean. It would make sense for Uranus to be the same. So what you're maybe left with is a power, the power of Uranus, which is not of the ocean, but can relate to the ocean, and becoming the master of it. Maybe you could even make a comparison to the story of Harry Potter, where you have the Deathly Hallows which made one a master of death. So then the ancient weapons in the story of One Piece would make one the master of the ocean. And this goes back to the connection between the tide jewels also having control over the wind. One power that would make a ton of sense to be the power of an ancient weapon would be a power to control the weather. And this adds all so beautifully with the very strange weather that we see within the Grand Line, and its origin potentially deriving from Uranus. The power of the tide jewel Kanju, which counteracts the ocean and suppresses its danger. I think that the power to control the weather in whatever way could be much the same, and honestly be thematically perfect. And obviously there are already many speculations on the topic, but I really just wanted to approach it through this story because already this story seems to be a huge inspiration for Oda. But that's all I really had to say today, guys. As always, I'm curious as to what you thought about this, whether you agree or disagree, and why. Just share your thoughts. Like the video if you like the video, dislike the video if you dislike the video. Make sure to subscribe if you want to be notified for my future content. And as always, guys, have a wonderful day.